These are devotions for people at a social distance. This morning in my devotions, I was reading the story of Jeroboam. It's in 1 Kings chapter 11, from 28 to 31. And Jeroboam is, of course, the first king of the separate kingdom of Israel that broke off from the larger kingdom and left Judah alone as its kingdom. And in some ways, I think Jeroboam has had a bad rap in the tradition because, of course, he divided the great nation of Israel, right? But this story actually has a whole lot of sympathy for Jeroboam and his position. It says this in verse 28. Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon, the great King Solomon, saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. So here we have this extraordinarily talented man, a gifted man, a man with a career, a man on the rise, right? You know, who wouldn't want to be Jeroboam? But wait a second. He is put in charge of forced labor, which is, of course, just a nice way of saying slavery, or at least short-term slavery in the north, in the lands of Ephraim and Manasseh, which of course will become the heartland of the new separate kingdom of Israel. So he is put in charge. He's a promising man. He's on the rise, and yet he's put in charge of basically enslaving his fellow Israelites. And so he meets a prophet named Ahijah, who tells him, the two of them go off alone as he's walking down the road, and the prophet says to him, the prophet takes his garment that he's wearing, this brand new robe that he's wearing, he tears it up into 12 pieces and gives 10 to Jeroboam and says, here, take these and make your own kingdom. So basically, he receives a message from God through this prophet saying, it's time for you to start a revolt. It's time for you to separate because your people are being enslaved. A person on the rise who basically gives up all of his promise, all of this career, this wonderful career that's laid out in front of him in order to stand up for people who are being enslaved. And he ends up, because Solomon finds out what he's thinking and doing, and he runs off and he hides in Egypt and has to wait for the chance to come back and set his people free, which won't happen until after Solomon dies, which is an interesting parallel, of course, to the whole story of Moses, who, saw his own people in Egypt enslaved and had to flee and run out of Egypt. So this is an incredible parallel to the story of Moses. And Moses has to bide his time and then come back and set his people free. Jeroboam kind of does the same thing. So how does this apply to us? Well, it is wonderful, have a career trajectory, have the promise that you have to be a person who has been gifted, who has ability, but don't just look at your career. What is God really calling you to do? And is there some injustice, something that you need to put your future on the line for in order to address and to challenge? And God calls people sometimes to be Jeroboams. And that's important. Don't miss your calling. Lord our God, thank you for the really promising and talented people that you send us, both in society and in the church. Thank you for the gifts and the skills you give to them. But let us not forget your call to do justice, to do what is right, and especially to stand up for the sake of your people. Amen.